Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this online panel event on conservation and global public health. I'm Ryan Henson, the Chief Executive for the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and I am delighted to be co-hosting today's event with WWF UK and the Wildlife Conservation Society. We are thrilled to have such an esteemed lineup of panelists join us today from all over the world with a breadth of experience in conservation and its links to public health, from championing the cause in Parliament to delivering these programmes on the ground. I'll start by telling you a bit about the Coalition, and then Mike Barrett from WWF will provide some opening remarks. Then we'll hear from each of the panelists, and finally, we'll open it up to questions from our audience. Please do type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen throughout the event, along with your name, job title, and organisation, and we'll get to them at the end. The Coalition for Global Prosperity was set up 2 years ago because we believe that Britain is at its best when it acts as a force for good in the world, and that a smart and effective aid budget, leveraging British expertise and British values, really can and does transform lives across the world. This has been proven time and time again. Whether it's peace building, global health security, or economic development and job creation, our aid budget really does help to make the world a safer, healthier, and more prosperous place for all. Today's event will explore how Britain's leadership in global conservation and environmental protection is helping to protect all of us from future global health challenges. Now, it's no secret that the mistreatment of animals and the environment, whether it be the illegal wildlife trade that fuels wet markets or habitat destruction that alters and destroys ecosystems, has serious impacts on human health. While it is essential that global forces come together to fight the catastrophic outbreak of COVID-19, we must also look to tackle the root causes of this disease and of so many others by protecting the natural environment and preserving the biodiversity of some of the world's most fragile ecosystems. That is why it is right that UK aid is spearheading conservation efforts globally. For example, at the end of last year, the Department for International Development launched a new Biodiversity Fund, pledging £220 million to deploy UK expertise around the world, helping local communities protect species under threat and preserve their natural habitats through a significant scale-up of the UK's Darwin Initiative. Biodiversity conservation is a win-win strategy for maintaining ecosystem health and protecting public health. So the UK's efforts in this area are not only the right thing to do, but they are keeping us all safer and healthier as well. And with that, I will hand over to Dr. Mike Barrett, who will provide some opening remarks on behalf of WWF. Mike, over to you.
Welcome to all our participants. It's clear that the majority of emerging infectious diseases and the rise in pandemics is linked to animal-derived pathogens. And it's also clear that there are a range of factors that drive our exposure to those. The destruction of natural habitats, such as tropical forests, the intensification of agricultural production, and the exploitation of wildlife. In short, this is about the way that we have failed to steward nature. And what's clear going forward is that the health of humanity depends on the health of the planet. It would be a mistake to focus action on just one part of the picture. We've got to be clear that action on wet markets or on the illegal wildlife trade, welcome though they are, won't alone prevent future pandemics. And nor will it prevent the ongoing destruction of nature that's helping drive climate change, food insecurity, and the sorts of other catastrophic events that we've seen over recent months, including the Amazon fires. At the heart of the problem is our ongoing conversion of more and more natural habitat around the world to produce agricultural commodities for international supply chains. So we're part of the problem. We're part of the problem as we continue to import the commodities like soy and palm oil that drive deforestation in countries like Brazil. And as we continue to decimate forests like the Amazon, we increase the risk of the next pandemic. Now, just as it oversimplifies things by assuming that tackling the wildlife trade alone will eliminate the risk of pandemics, so it's also an oversimplification to think that we can buy our way out of the destruction of nature through financial support. Again, welcome and vital though that is. We won't actually change the game until we stop buying and importing the products that actually drive habitat loss around the world. And the choice in front of us now is simple. We're in a severe economic downturn. We can either react in the short term with business as usual fixes for the economy, or we can plan for the long term. And if we get this wrong, if we don't tackle the underlying causes of the destruction of nature, we will lock in the certainty of the next global crisis. And with that, I'll pass back to Ryan.
Well, thank you, Mike, for those opening remarks, which I think have set the scene for us really, really well. We will now hear from Ruth Edwards MP. Ruth was elected as the Member of Parliament for Rushcliffe in the 2019 election, and Ruth is a member of the Conservative Environment Network. Ruth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Yeah, I'm good to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. As Ryan says, I'm the new Member of Parliament for Rushcliffe, or to put that into context for people, I'm the new Ken Clark. They're perhaps a little bit more au fait with the digital technology. This is absolutely the right time to be having this conversation. I think the pandemic has brought home to a lot of people just how closely interconnected our world is, and also the delicate balance between humankind and the natural environment in which we live. And now is the time to not only make the environmental case for conservation, but also the economic case for it and the global public health case for it as well. So as Ryan and Mike have both said, both biodiversity and climate change have a huge impact on public health. Whether you're looking at air pollution, which we know contributes to some 36,000 premature deaths per year here in the UK, the biggest environmental threat to human health here, or zoonotic diseases. Mike's been speaking about their link to infectious diseases in humans. There's people far more qualified than me on this call to talk about that, but I understand that approximately 60% of all human infectious diseases and about 75% of emerging infectious diseases that have affected people over the past 3 decades have originated in animals. So there's clearly a need to rethink our use of land, both in terms of agriculture and to stop our enrichment into wild animals' habitats. Both biodiversity and climate change are also interdependent, of course, as each exacerbates the other. And so I really strongly believe that from the tragedy of this virus, we must work to bring positive change and to build something better. So to build an economy that looks after our planet, trains people for the jobs of tomorrow, green jobs that will bring both fantastic career options to many parts of our country and our world, but also that will deliver something that's good for the environment and that will help us to live healthier lives, both physically and mentally. And I think the UK has a sort of dual responsibility in this area. First of all, we need to get our house in order here at home, protecting our natural environment, and also we need to use all the levers at our disposal so that other nations will do the same. I think we do need to do a better job at looking after the many rich and diverse environments we have here in the UK. I'm on the Environment Bill Committee. I'm really thrilled that we're passing this piece of legislation. It's got some great provisions around looking after biodiversity, including requiring all new housing developments to have a 10% biodiversity net gain for at least 30 years. It demands the creation of local nature recovery strategies, linking up to a nationwide nature recovery strategy, which the aim is to create 500,000 hectares of wildlife habitat. So it's a great way to encourage communities to restore local habitats, as is the Nature for Climate Fund, which is £640 million that we're investing in tree planting schemes, peatland restoration, and replenishing native wildlife populations. And whereas government funding is very important, I believe getting private sector investment in here is as well. So in the budget, we announced the Natural Environment Impact Fund to encourage £10 million worth of private sector investment in environmental projects, 4 pilot projects looking at everything from peatland restoration to cleaning up the marine environment in Poole Harbour were launched actually at the beginning of this week, I understand. But we also need to look at how we can bring about change internationally. I think there are there are more, but the 3 levers I want to focus on very briefly are diplomacy, our aid budget, and also accelerating a global green economy. So looking at diplomacy, we've got our presidency of the G7 and COP26. And I think we should be using that to push for the elimination of the trade and consumption in wildlife, including probably for traditional medicine. And I'm sorry if that sounds disrespectful to other cultures, but I think if you look at the massive global death toll this pandemic has had, and obviously there are competing theories as to where it's come from, but I think we know it's likely to have originated from wildlife, and if not, certainly other recent pandemics are. Carrying on as things are is risking the health of populations all over the world. I also think we need to be advocating to halt and reverse habitat loss, advocating for commitments to protect a minimum proportion of land and sea for nature. And I think this could potentially be modelled on our 30 by 30 initiative, which of course is the initiative to have 1/3 of the oceans becoming marine protected areas by 2030. When it comes to our aid budget, we have a really strong internationally respected brand in DFID, the Department for International Development. All of the above that I've just mentioned will obviously impact on the way of life in communities in developing countries, and we should be using our aid budget to help make the adjustments that they need. So I think Ryan mentioned in his opening remarks the Biodiversity Fund. We've also got things like the Partnerships for Forest programme, helping to create sustainable jobs and livelihoods for communities in Africa and Southeast Asia. And then finally, on accelerating a global green economy, I think one of the things that's really struck me throughout this pandemic is the way in which industry has worked together and turned around production lines incredibly quickly, often within weeks, to manufacture ventilators, non-invasive breathing aids, PPE. I was astonished at the speed at which it happened. And I think we need to harness this creativity and this speed by looking at how we as government can incentivize companies to work together to bring to market solutions that will drastically cut emissions, for example, in aviation or in energy generation, and that we should be doing this in partnership with universities and research institutes in the developing world. I also, as I said, want to encourage private investment in sustainable business on an international scale. Not just here in the UK. One way to do this, I think, would be to require pension funds to disclose to their members how exposed they are to climate-related risks. And I think we should also obviously be undertaking something called the Dasgupta review at the moment, which is a Treasury Commission study on the economics of biodiversity. I'd like to see that published ahead of the UN Biodiversity Summit in 2021, so that we can pioneer an economic policy framework which fully accounts for nature and the risks and costs that emerge from its mismanagement, as well as, of course, the benefits of managing it properly.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth, for those opening remarks. We'll now hear from our second panelist, Dr. Kang, Executive Director of WCS Asia. Aili is an award-winning conservationist and ecologist, leading on strategy and operations for the Wildlife Conservation Society in China. Aili, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, everyone. Hope everyone stay well. when I prepared this remark, I just kind of quickly review my past 4 months, and I still remember by the end of January, when I returned Shanghai, my hometown, I be informed by my husband, we needed to stay at home. And also when I returned New York in late March, I informed again the lockdown. So basically I have been locked down for 4 months so far. So, but on the other side, because of lockdown, I actually have a lot of time to engage directly when I was in China with a lot of discussion about the changes we needed to make for the wildlife trade. And also I observed significant improvement of the policy happened in China in the last 4 months to tackle the wildlife trade issues, which I think it's quite remarkable for me to thinking about. And among all those policies, the most significant one, I think everyone noticed, is on the February 24th, that the Standing Committee of the China People's Congress issued a decision. And that decision is to ban the poaching, hunting, transportation, sailing, and consumption of any terrestrial species for food purpose. This is cover both the animal from wild and also captive breeding. And how significant it is talking about over 2,500 species now distributed in China will be covered by this decision, banned from any type of food consumption. That's include food therapy from type of medicine consideration. At the same time that the Standing Committee also announced a series of work plan to review different type of laws, which the most important one is the wildlife protection law and also the animal epidemic prevention law. And also there's a new biosecurity law is under reviewing. And all those will be kind of speed up in this year to reflect the problem of the zoonotic disease and try to prevent the future. So in general, I think that China set up a very comprehensive plan and also action to try to restrict the wildlife trade for the goal to prevent the future zoonotic related pandemic. At the same time, I mean, no policy can be perfect. And for this decision, in my view, there's 2 loopholes that we should continue to work on and also to emphasize, to provide the support. One is to focus on consumption for food, I think is a start, but there's also trade for other type first, such as fur market and pet and also medicine use. While it may not be fully banned, but it needed to have more restricted regulation and management, such as risk assessment, risk management, and also to more restrictly screen the passenger, to do the passenger screening and also quarantine process. So there's a lot of those regulations needed to follow up to address other type of trade. So the consumption should be a start point, but not the end point of this whole effort. And secondly, I think just as Ruth mentioned, and we also, I feel that TCM still have a loophole that should be addressed. It is not only conservation team's job, it is actually should be a joint effort from the TCM group and the conservation and the government authority together to look into the relative legislation for the TCM in China. Actually, recently, China has decided they will move all the endangered species away from their most important TCM list at the national level. So I think that's a great step, but needed to be further encouraged for more effort to address the TCM related work. So those are 2 kind of loopholes I have seen. By the end, I want to say is this could not be just the effort by China. It should be all the nations globally to look into more collective effort to address the trade as one part, but most significant part of this problem. And we needed to manage the interface between human and nature more wisely, and to, I think, as the says, address its position. We needed to encourage all the nations to ban all the commercial trade for wildlife, for human consumption, particularly bird and mammal species, and also the relevant market. That will be an essential step that we needed to make our mind and make it happen. Otherwise, business will be as usual. And after several years, either SARS or COVID or other new zoonotic will happen again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Idy, for sharing your take on our discussion today. We'll now hear from Dr. Niall McCann, Director of Conservation at National Park Rescue. Niall's work focuses on tackling poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. Niall has worked for a number of conservation projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Niall, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and good afternoon to everybody at home, wherever you are in the world. So right now, we're all dealing with the appalling consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, but we cannot forget about the cause. COVID-19 was caused by our broken relationship with nature. The links between conservation and public health, wealth, and well-being have never been more obvious. In January, the World Economic Forum rated biodiversity loss as the second most impactful and the third most likely risk for the next decade. At the most basic level, as Mike said earlier, we need healthy and functioning ecosystems to regulate our climate, provide us with abundant clean water, clean air, protein from meat and fish, pollination services from insects and other taxa, and all of the other ecosystem services that we get for free from a healthy environment. And we now know that we also need healthy and functioning ecosystems to mitigate the spread of zoonotic disease. The existential threat that biodiversity loss poses to human societies is a global crisis, requiring a response from all sectors that puts planetary health at the heart of our socioeconomic model. But for the purposes of these opening remarks, I will focus on just one of the most critical components of the nexus between conservation and public health, the trade in wildlife. Traditionally, the trade in wildlife has been regarded as a conservation issue, the type of thing that former Prime Minister David Cameron famously referred to as green crap, and therefore of little concern to politicians, to business, or to society at large. But now that hundreds of thousands of people are dying and the global economy has ground to a halt, as a direct result of the failure to regulate this trade, the wildlife trade can no longer be regarded as a fringe issue, as it's obvious that it affects us all. It is also clear that regulatory decisions taken in one part of the world can have a profound impact across the globe. This is not about scapegoating. This is not about targeting one country over others. The trade and exploitation of wildlife is a global issue, and the failure to effectively regulate and police this trade has global consequences. As a result, our response must be global, with legally binding international regulations that we can use to hold errant countries to account. Among conservation practitioners, myself included, there's an understandable focus on the illegal wildlife trade, a $23 billion industry funded by transnational organized criminals that is driving many species to extinction and robs the world of around $2 trillion in ecosystem services every year. But zoonotic diseases don't discriminate between legal and illegal trade. And we must recognize that the legal trade in wildlife has just as insidious effect on biodiversity loss and is just as likely to be the cause of the next pandemic. To put the scale of the legal trade in wildlife into perspective, the United States alone imports around 200 million live animals every single year, and with them a kaleidoscope of pathogens, and with few exceptions has no laws requiring disease surveillance for wildlife entering the country. In China, the legal trade in wildlife is valued at $74 billion and is a source of income or employment for up to 14 million people. But these figures pale into insignificance next to the cost, in human and in cash terms, of the COVID-19 pandemic. With what we know about emerging infectious diseases and the role that wildlife plays in the origin and transmission of novel pathogens, it is paramount that we change our approach to wildlife trade in two principal ways. Firstly, we must effectively police the illegal wildlife trade. This means stopping the trade and consumption of wildlife before it happens, by better protecting wildlife at its source. This is easier said than done, but it is possible. In 2 years, my organisation, National Park Rescue, has reduced poaching by 98% in a major wildlife crime hotspot in northern Zimbabwe. Policing the trade also means breaking the organised criminal networks that shift thousands of tons of contraband across the world, leaving environmental and social devastation in their wake. To do this, wildlife crime must be embedded in the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, and these laws must be enforced, with sanctions levied against nations that fail to uphold this agreement. Secondly, we must ban the trade in high-risk wildlife. This means agreeing on universal definitions of wildlife, identifying species that pose a risk to public health, as well as those that are at risk of extinction, and strictly enforcing bans around their trade, no matter what the end use, be it for food, medicine, or as pets. CITES, the existing regulatory framework governing the legal trade in wildlife, does not account for public health, and it is voluntary. Both of these things must change. These developments will require a significant investment in law enforcement efforts, programs of demand reduction, the provision of alternative sources of protein and income for people affected by these new laws, and the creation and implementation of exemptions for sustainable consumption by indigenous communities. This will also require unprecedented cooperation among nations, but there is a strong incentive for cooperation. We quite literally cannot afford another pandemic on the scale of this one. COVID-19 has been a shared catastrophe, and our efforts to prevent the next pandemic must also be shared. This crisis has already seen the genesis of impressive alliances of NGOs, such as endpandemics.earth, of which my organisation, National Park Rescue, is a part, which are pooling the talents and resources of dozens of NGOs to protect wildlife habitats and bring the commercial trade in wildlife to an end. Now we require bold leadership at government level. With the Convention on Biological Diversity coming up later this year, and with the UK preparing to host the COP26 Climate Summit in 2021, now is the time for the UK government to use our position in the G7 and the G20 to call for the changes that I have outlined, and to use our global diplomatic influence to facilitate our partner nations in protecting wildlife at its source and transitioning away from the risky trade in wildlife. This will require the strategic unification of the remits of DFID, DEFRA, the Department of International Trade, the FCO, and the MOD, to ensure that our foreign policy delivers strong environmental protection and the cascade of health, development, and security benefits that follow on from it, enabling us to build towards a green recovery and mitigate the risks of another pandemic. Right now, it's hard to look beyond the human toll of the crisis, the millions of lives irreversibly damaged and the trillions of dollars wiped off the global economy. But once the immediate impact has subsided, and we are no longer scrambling to keep pace with the spread of the virus, it is vital that the international community comes together to ensure that this never happens again. And as the WHO announced last week, the way we do that is by protecting and preserving nature. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Niall. Next up, it is a pleasure to introduce Rob McNeil, a strategic consultant at Conservation International. Rob served for 16 years as a British Army officer before moving on to Conservation International, where he focuses on the nexus between conservation and conflict resolution. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. It's good to be here. So I'm going to focus a little bit more from the field angle, complementing what the guys have already talked about. So really to kick off, human resilience has long been a critical component of conservation strategy, given the impact of unpredictable weather patterns, drought, flooding, overgrazing, population growth, conflict, and changing temperatures. Our goal as conservationists is to incentivize change, introduce measures to protect, restore, and sustain nature. A key part of this is by realizing the value of natural resources to local communities themselves. Indigenous peoples are the primary custodians of much of the world's most valuable remaining forests, grasslands, savanna, wetlands, and oceans. When we fail to recognize Indigenous peoples' communities' rights, we weaken our planet's resilience and reduce our ability to deliver well-being and prosperity for all. At CI, we prioritize a rights-based approach in supporting Indigenous communities we work with right now. Food insecurity, lack of income, lack of clean water, and access to healthcare are being exacerbated by the pandemic. There is also increased pressure on natural resources through contra-urbanization and deforestation. Illegal mining and poaching, which ignites conflict, can very quickly lead to instability. One of the decisive components of any conservation strategy is to invest in clear and accountable community governance. Strong community buy-in and leadership is crucial as an enabler to set the platform for any emergency response, social development, or conservation activity. It provides the access point for stimulating ecosystem services and alternative revenue generation, tourism, microloan initiatives, and sustainable agriculture, all of which improve livelihoods through the protection of nature. It also generates a necessary forum to conduct peace building and in delivering a networked approach to defeating the illegal wildlife trade, as Niall's covered. So by patiently assisting local communities in enhancing the governance of their natural resources, conservation and development actors are also building the foundations of stability. Environmentally linked conflict is a challenge we face now and will increasingly face in the future. In rural communities, competition for natural resources inflames conflict and perpetuates displacement. Pandemics or natural disasters can ignite these fault lines and multiply the root causes of conflict. Ultimately, it is near impossible to make progress at scale where conflict exists between custodians and stakeholders alike. For example, the science tells us that forest protection and restoration is fundamental to keep the planet alive, yet we stand by and watch increased mining and deforestation in the Amazon, knowing that this is bringing humans closer to nature. Moreover, competition for land use, challenges to indigenous governance systems, lack of sustainable economic opportunities, and the persecution of the rights of indigenous peoples all perpetuate conflict, which must be addressed before a sustainable way forward can be achieved. So if nature is increasingly a driver of conflict and instability, it must therefore be considered part of the solution. By focusing on good governance, nature-based solutions, and building community leadership, the benefits of good biodiversity conservation work and climate change adaptation extend far beyond the perceived boundaries of this conservation sector. So in summary, if mistreating the environment poses a serious threat to global public health, we must invest more in setting the conditions for interventions. If we're willing to leverage community leadership by incentivizing behavior change, it must become sustainable. And I'm not just talking about financially, it must become a way of life. So we've got 10 years to get this done, to hit the 30 by 30 goals. And all stakeholders would take real confidence if the UK government committed to this timeline, not just in terms of its rhetoric, but in terms of how it forecasts funding allocation. No longer can nature conservation be seen as a peripheral issue. Our survival and livelihoods depend on the health of the planet. It is critical that climate and biodiversity stay at the top of the agenda in 2020 and beyond, and that leaders maintain the momentum in an accountable and transparent way. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you so much to all our panelists for such fascinating opening remarks, which have set us up for a great discussion today. I should say that Julie Marson MP, the Member of Parliament for Hertford and Stortford, was supposed to be with us, but unfortunately has been called away due to urgent parliamentary business. But Julie is a fellow member of the Conservative Environment Network and is really committed to this issue. And we hope very much to have Julie join us at another event in the future. We will now take questions from our audience. If you've joined us since the introduction, thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon. You are very welcome. Please do keep submitting questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Now, our first question comes from Jonathan Watts, Global Environment Editor at The Guardian. And his question is this: in the UK, should we move from conservation to rewilding? And if so, in which region or regions would you start? What would be the economic benefits to local communities? And I will go to Niall first, followed by Ruth, if that's okay, to hear about whether or not that might work in Rushcliffe. But first, Niall.
Thanks, Ryan. Really interesting question. I think most of us will be aware of what's happening down in Knepp in Sussex with the rewilding projects at the Knepp estate with Isabella Tree, whose book, Rewilding, I'm sure many of the listeners would have read. What they've demonstrated is that a shift away from intensive agriculture can be economically not just viable, but make you far more prosperous. They were struggling very much on the breadline as in intensive agriculture, focusing on dairy, which is very much you're on a knife edge between profit and loss if you're in that industry, and propped up by subsidies. If we're looking at what's going to happen as we exit the EU, there's going to be a reduction in environmental subsidies. That's essentially an inevitability. And I think it's very right for the British government to look at new ways of subsidising the use of agricultural land, and turning it back to nature is an incredibly positive way of doing that. Now, to go specifically to the question of conservation versus rewilding, I think we need to look at our national park network. In the United Kingdom, we've got a very large network of national parks, of which we're very proud. But Michael Gove used the phrase that we have a different model of national parks to most countries. And that's euphemism at its worst, in the same way as Donald Trump has a different model to race relations, or Bolsonaro has a different model to forestry programming. Our model for national parks, it's not worth the name national park, really. That they're elaborate upland farming areas of land. And what we need to do, really, I think, is to choose a national park and fully rewild it, have it totally for the benefit of biodiversity and all of the knock-on benefits that go with it. Remove livestock from there. Now, that can't be Lake District, because farming is part of the intangible cultural heritage of the Lake District National Park by UNESCO. So maybe we should choose somewhere else, one of the Scottish national parks or Exmoor. Take farming away from that, fully rewild, and see the enormous knock-on benefits in ecotourism, in climate, in health, in flood mitigation, and everything else that goes with it. It's definitely a part of our future, and I think we need to look again at our approach to conservation in the country.
Thank you, Niall. Ruth, would rewilding work in Rushcliffe?
Well, I suppose it depends what part of Rushcliffe you want to rewild, and what we're proposing you do with it. I mean, we have had some very interesting projects there in the past, where former coal mines have been turned into country parks there. So I think, you know, it is a potential model for some areas, but I think it's important that we are making sure that industries like agriculture that do use the land do so in harmony with the environment, and that we use agricultural land to promote restoring biodiversity. So if you look at the agriculture bill and the subsidies that we have there, a lot of those are around preserving the environment and using land for that, and specifically paying people for public goods related to environmental improvement.
Thank you, Ruth. Right, our second question comes from Baroness Manzilla Uden, and her question is this: each year, the Muslim community donates hundreds of millions of pounds to charitable causes globally, particularly post-crisis and natural disaster incidents. How should larger NGOs encourage this massive untapped resource towards our global efforts for conservation? And I wonder, Eilidh, if I might come to you, first of all, for that question.
How international organization can tackle to look into this investment? I think one component is the nature disaster protection, and also recover from the nature disaster. I mean, this zoonotic disease itself can be in certain way to thinking about, and the post-COVID-19 is the time for a lot of community to get to reboost their revenue, which could be a problem. Let me say, currently we heard from such as our project in Cambodia, and I believe also in Africa, there's already some of the reports talking about, because of the local community do not have tourist revenue, and some of them return to the protected area or impacted places to get their revenue, which not good for them and not good for the nature. And I think that's also type of nature disaster category we need to think about, especially post-COVID-19. It's the time for us to work with those local community. One is to support them for the early reporting system to monitor further potential zoonotic passenger, and also build them more capacity to look into other revenue instead of go back to rely more heavily on the nature resources. Those type of action, in my mind, can be a type of recover from this type of nature disaster. Although I agree, I think it's more kind of human disaster, but it's a combination between the human and the nature link. So that's just a quick thought for this.
Great, thank you. Niall.
Thanks, Ryan. I think what Baroness van Ziller-Uden has touched upon really well is that conservation is basically a white person's industry at the moment. And what we really need are strong influences from ethnic minorities. If you've got the entire global Islamic community that donates approximately 10% of their income every single year to charitable causes, and yet there are no Muslim global influences within conservation, it's hardly any surprise that that enormous amount of money isn't finding its way into environmental programs. So I think what large NGOs and other conservation organizations can do is to actively promote members of ethnic minorities to get into conservation through fellowships, through internships, through whatever means they have, to really try and diversify conservation. So if you go out bird watching, you're basically just seeing white faces. I'm really conscious that my organization as well, we need to improve the ethnic diversity of our organization. We've certainly never thought about tapping into the fact that there's an enormous number of people that are wanting to donate to environmental causes from sectors of society that are not traditionally linked to it. So I think it's an incredibly important point. And what we need is a strong focus on non-white influences within the conservation industry.
Rob.
Hi, thanks. I think it's a great question. I'll just offer here, I mean, what an opportunity, and I think us in this sector, it's our fault that there's a question even as to where available resources should be or could be delivered. I would suggest to the Baroness, pick a champion, be the champion of forest conservation. Keep those big old trees, in those Amazon forests. Put money towards restoration. One of the things that we really suffer from, that's the wrong way to put it. One of the challenges we have is accessing unrestricted funding. And if the community that she's referring to was able to champion, the restoration protection of our rainforests, then I would say there's an opportunity to do a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you all. Our next question comes from Rachel Mulrennan, Campaigns Advisor at the Changing Markets Foundation, which is an environmental and health campaigning organisation. And Rachel's question is this: it's been suggested that industrial intensive farming poses an increased risk of pandemic outbreaks, from the clearance of natural habitats for crops to the monocultural nature of intensely reared animals, such as chickens and pigs. What do you think the UK could be doing to mitigate this risk, both domestically and in collaboration with other countries? Who would like to go at that? Niall.
Well, the obvious first step is absolutely sticking to the standards that we have when it comes to animal welfare. So we're looking at the moment at a trade deal with the United States, and there's a huge amount of pressure coming from the United States government for the UK to drop our standards of animal welfare to allow in the animals that they breed in appalling conditions, cesspits of disease that are rife for zoonotic outbreak. If Britain really wants to make a difference, we have to stand firm when it comes to animal welfare. Another thing I think that's really important is that the government really starts to encourage organic farming. Now, the biggest impact we can all have on climate change and everything else is to reduce the amount of meat we eat. That's going to have a massive knock-on impact on many farmers, of course. So we need to be looking at how we change the livelihoods of those farmers. Moving into organic production, or at least low-intensity production, is one of the ways we can do that. Charging what it costs is another important thing. At the moment, a pint of milk costs me £1 or whatever it is in Morrison's. And that's ridiculous if you think about the cost of what it actually takes to produce. So making food cost what it costs to produce and charging that back to the consumer, I think also will make a big difference. But we need at the very, very least to stick to our standards when it comes to animal welfare, and to insist on that with any of our trading partners.
Thank you, Niall. Would anyone else like to come in on that question? Otherwise, we will go to our next one, which is from Katharina Silen-Moy, who is a research associate at the Institute of Zoology. And Katharina's question is this: given the theory that a permanent shutdown of wet markets would affect patterns of food consumption, and that subsequently, due to the large number of farmers, traders, and consumers involved, the abolition of wet markets could lead to an explosion of an uncontrollable black market, would this potentially involve a greater risk to public and global health than an attempt to regulate the legal live animal markets in China today in a more scientific and evidence-based way? Who would like to have a go at answering that?
I'm happy to, but Eiley should.
Eiley, over to you.
Thanks. This is a big argument and debate. That's a great question. It has been discussed in China, even in February, when conservation groups try to further encourage government to do this. We think there are several levels of this question we need to think about. First of all, to ban the consumption actually will reduce the trade volume and the people's motivation to purchase a bigger group of those products, which means that overall trade volume will be reduced because of this type of ban. The second, it's true that some of those trade will move to underground, which means that will be the moment, and that is when those legislation come effective, the law enforcement become the most critical component, because all those trade become illegal, and the law enforcement and the related investment to continue support or even doubling the investment for those become critical. But if we put all those still legal, I think that's also another way is the law enforcement people will be very difficult to try to identify legal and illegal if all in the legal market. It's itself a very significant trade-off. So to talking about how move the because of those ban may move the trade in underground, I think the solution, one is increasing law enforcement, but second, we could not, because of those will move to the underground, so do not hesitate to do the ban, because the ban itself still will significantly reduce the demand and the trade underground.
Thank you, Eiley. Niall, do you want to go in?
Yeah, Eiley's essentially answered it perfectly. I'd just like to give the precedent was in the legal sale of ivory that happened twice, 1999 and 2011, and 2009, to China and to Japan. Both of those, they were legally, they were allowed, CITES allowed them, and the source countries could then sell their ivory out to Asia. And what that did was that it encouraged a market, because people suddenly thought that ivory was acceptable again. And the demand, as opposed to sating the demand skyrocketed as a result of flooding the market. So really, banning these things does do exactly what Eiley says. It massively reduces the number of people that are willing to do this, because many people aren't willing to do something that's criminal. Yes, of course, you then have a black market, but that's no reason not to police something. We don't just suddenly make heroin completely acceptable to everyone because we're worried about a black market. We just need to get the policing right, and law enforcement is critical. But then I think we also need to make accountability at the very front of this. If countries are failing to enforce the law, then they need to be accountable for those failures, and there need to be sanctions at an international level on countries that fail to implement the laws around the wildlife crime that we already have.
Thanks. I'll come to you, Ruth, and then Rob.
Sorry, I think I was on mute there. I'd just like to agree with the previous comments. I mean, throughout history, we'd always used regulation as part of the solution to many areas of life. And as Niall was just saying, obviously, you know, we have outlawed the use of drugs like heroin. You know, we won't just be putting, obviously regulating will drive certain activity underground, but it will massively reduce the number of people who use it. And the flip side of regulating is to make sure that we have this appropriate investment in law enforcement. But I think there's also something about what we do culturally and making things socially unacceptable, and working with communities to stop social acceptance of customs and traditions that perhaps are very harmful to both ourselves and the environment. So I think that's another part of the puzzle, but absolutely regulation does have to be part of it. Of course, we will drive some of that underground, but that is the same in almost every area of regulation, and therefore we need to make sure we're ready to enforce that regulation.
Thank you, Ruth. Rob?
Yeah, Ruth pretty much nailed what I was going to say, but I'll just add, you know, it's got to be a comprehensive approach, and there's numbers of strands of work that needs to be, or impact that needs to be delivered concurrently. And I just want to highlight that incentivizing behavior change or attitude shifts does take time. And there's, unfortunately, and I understand it, but it's still unfortunate that there's a results-driven aspect to all of this. And I'd look to government to sort of come back on this one. You know, often grants are delivered for a period of 5 years. Now, I get why. But at the same time, you know, when you're looking to shift attitudes with local communities by building partnerships, empathy, trust, investing in their livelihoods, you know, addressing their needs, and therefore giving them a reason to change their behavior, you know, and most importantly, allowing them to lead the way. It takes more than 5 years to make those changes. So all of this is great, and enforcement 100% get it. You know, there's got to be the right buy-in by government, there's got to be the right policy pathways, there's got to be the right investment in relationships through local partners. But give us the time to get that done, because otherwise it's not sustainable in the long run.
Great, thank you, Rob. We will go to our next question, which is from Sarah Eppel from Eppel Sustainability. And Sarah's question is this: after the financial crisis in 2008, only $1 out of every $6 was spent on sustainable infrastructure. How can we ensure that the UK government will come out of the COVID crisis with environmental conservation central to its financial strategy? And I wonder, Ruth, if I might come to you. We know that there will be, well, it's rumoured that there'll be a summer budget. What would you like to see in it from a conservation and environmental perspective?
Thank you. Well, it's quite interesting. I've been writing a piece for the Parliament's in-house sort of magazine this week on the economic rather than public health case for a green recovery. And although there was less spent on green recovery schemes, it's quite interesting. A study from the United States showed that the green stimulus packages actually generated 20% more return on investment than traditional stimulus packages. So I think we have a great comparatively recent evidence base there as a good as a good precedent for doing that. What I would like to see is more investment in, oh my gosh, sorry, I've just had a thing saying my computer's about to restart and there's nothing I can do about it, so this could be interesting. I would like to see investment in things like the electric vehicle charging network. Obviously that was announced in the previous budget, 400 million. We need to drastically clean up the vehicles on our roads. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see investments in retraining people at all stages of their career for jobs in the green industry, particularly renewable energy, particularly looking at green vehicles, whether that's on the road or in the sky. And I think we could certainly partner that with the government's agenda of sort of levelling up and spreading prosperity throughout the country. And there's a very interesting project in my constituency where we have the Ratcliffe-on-Soar power station, which is one of the last coal-fired power stations in the country. And that is scheduled to actually close in a couple of years. And it's on an enormous site. And a big part of that site will be dedicated as like a green technology park. And there'll be a sort of zero carbon academy there to train people in areas of the economy. So I think there's some really exciting things we could be doing, and I think certainly from what I've heard and seen from government colleagues, certainly in the last budget and in our manifesto, I think there's a lot of hope to think that, you know, we will see some great investments there, and obviously myself and lots of other colleagues will be putting that sort of pressure on ministers.
Thank you, Ruth. Niall.
There we go. Thank you. Yes, thanks, Ruth, as well. So Sarah's question was twofold, really. So firstly, looking at the value, and then secondly, how do we hold government to account? So in terms of values, already $8 trillion has been set aside to reconstruct deconstructed economies as a result of COVID. So these are figures coming out of Chatham House. So COVID is going to cost the global economy in the region of 10 trillion, give or take. Already 8 trillion has been set aside to reconstruct those economies. That is 35 times the amount, the maximum annual spend, if we enacted every single one of the Paris Climate Change Accord levers at once. So 35 times that to completely green our economy straight away. Now, that means we really cannot afford not to do these things. That money is going to be spent anyway. It simply might as well be spent in a way that enables to achieve 30 by 30 and enables to achieve this green recovery. So the economic argument is there, very much so, as Ruth alluded to. But then if it comes to holding the government to account, there's a fantastic precedent recently. Heathrow Runway 3 was stopped because it was not conducive to Britain meeting its climate change targets. And so you can hold the government to account in the courts. Obviously, you can do it by voting for a government that's going to be green. But we also need to realise that if we're failing on our climate responsibilities, now biodiversity responsibilities, and the things are linked, you can hold the government to account in the courts of the land, and we should be doing that. It's happened in the Netherlands. Civil lawsuits sued the Dutch government successfully for not keeping up with their climate change targets, and Heathrow Runway 3 in the UK was the same, and we should follow those procedures if we need to. You hold them to account.
Great, thank you, Niall. Would anyone else, Rob or Eiley, would you like to come in on that? Rob?
Yeah, I can. Like I agree with everything that's been said. It's an unprecedented opportunity that we've got in front of us in terms of, building back better, or whatever the latest punch word is, or punchline. But I think what we must also do is educate. Our sector, has that as one of its functions. We must educate people about what is needed right now and put it in simple terms, but also put it in corporate terms. We must develop conservation finance models that understand what a bottom line looks like. The world of donations has got to pass. It's got to be a sustainable model for financing. But I think back to the point about education, nature is a stakeholder now. And it's got to be reinforced. And there's a number of ways to do that. Government's got a responsibility to focus on the regulation and the disclosures, put pressure on the business community to be able to demonstrate its progress, but put a peer pressure within the business community to ensure that it's seen as a good thing, to be doing, right? And so if you attach $1 to the restoration of nature, then we're onto a good thing. If it's just increasingly viewed as a sort of a black hole of funding donations, then we're not hiding to nothing here. So we've got to be smart in our sector. Government's got to be punchy with its regulations. And business has got to come and play this game with us, because it's not going away.
Thank you, Rob. Our next question comes from Nicholas Tubbs, Senior Programme Manager at Fauna and Flora International. And Nicholas's question is this: how can conservation actors be invited to the table with public health actors so that together we can break silos and work together to leverage impact at scale? Who would like a first crack at that? I'll come to you, Rob, and then Niall.
Thanks, Nick. I hope you're well. Yeah, I mean, there's so many cross-cutting issues, and we do suffer from a clash of cultures. It's a fact. It's up to us to force ourselves into the same room. Government's also got an opportunity to do this. You know, government policy, I'm hoping, is written by experts. But it's not often that you get the private sector invited to those discussions. Those who've had time in the field, those who really understand, you know, the minutiae, that have the skills through connections with communities in the field. If we're talking about conservation overseas. So that's the first thing. You know, I would say government's got a role in putting us all in the same room. I think we've also just got to understand, and I referred to it in my opening remarks, you know, that the health and well-being and the resilience of the human race has its foundations in nature. You know, we've been shown this in a very dramatic way. So if we don't wake up from that and bridge those cultural boundaries or those sectoral boundaries, then frankly, we're not doing our jobs. I think it's a great question. I think government's got a role. I think collaborations and partnerships must be the way forward. That includes public and private.
I was muted. No.
Thanks, Ryan. And just to reiterate what Rob said, it's about collaborations. So there are already some really strong alliances that are being built out of this crisis. We've joined one called endpandemics.earth, and I would thoroughly encourage everyone to look endpandemics.earth up. They're a network of NGOs that are interested in conservation, public health, governments, everything. And I think it's these types of alliances which mix the private sector with the public sector, with the NGO sector, which are going to make the difference. And within there, we've got very, very strong lobbying capacity, very, very strong intellectual capacity. And it's about pooling the knowledge and the resources of all these different groups, which traditionally everyone's sat in their own silos. Even conservation organisation to conservation organisation, they won't talk to each other. They're competing over the same funds, and that needs to stop. And what I've been delighted about through this shared catastrophe that we've all had is that a lot of those barriers have been brought down and people are coming together. And that's what's going to be required. But we also then need to hold government to account to make sure they're at the table as well. So any of us with contacts in government, crack the whip and make sure that there is constant focus on this, that public health and the environment are at the heart of all of our foreign policy and domestic policy decisions.
Thank you, Niall. Ruth, would you like to come in on that one?
Thanks. Well, yes, I think it is very important. I think, you know, there's a strong tradition of cross-departmental working across government, whether that's cabinet committees that are set up for various things, or interdepartmental teams for different projects. So I do think it's something that we should be focused on, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of that in future policy making.
Thank you, Ruth. My next question, this is from an anonymous questioner. Which governments around the world have taken the most decisive action to improve conservation, and how can the UK mirror and support their efforts? Ivory, can I come to you for that one?
Well, first of all, it also depends on every country's capacity and economic capacity and human capacity. So when the country volume is so significant, it definitely can invest more into conservation. So it's kind of unfair to compare Fiji and China about who doing better according to the investment of those. But on the other side, there's a certain type, if I look into the current, some of those improvements, for example, Fiji and also Indonesia has announced more than 10% of marine protected area in their marine system, which compared to their capacity, they have a bigger commitment. So I would say I do not hesitate to just use one criteria to comment who doing the best. But I can say, for example, besides Fiji, Indonesia, I'm also proud of what's going on in China in the recent 10 years to settle for more and more restricted policies, such as its red line policy, to really look into the bottom of the conservation and to see what kind of development could not touch. And so I think those are three type of country example for me in Asia to look into different type of success.
Thank you, Eileen. Ruth.
Thank you. So, on answer to the questions, which country, I don't know the answers to that. In terms of what the UK government can do, I think I bring myself back to what I said in my opening remarks, which is about using the Department for International Development, which is a highly respected international brand with teams who are specialized in many different disciplines, including, of course, health and conservation, and using our aid budget and our expertise, not just the finance, but the expertise to support communities who are trying to make changes to improve biodiversity and conservation, and look at other ways of making a living, ones that are more harmonious with their natural environment. So I think that's a key role that government can play.
Thank you. Right, Rob.
Just to add on to that, I mean, I think it's a difficult question, and Eileen answered that really well, and I'd agree with every one of her points on, it depends on your means and what you're able to do with them. I mean, you look at what Costa Rica's done, for example, it's extraordinary. But I just add a message to Ruth there. Just have a look over the channel and see what European Union is putting together right now. And then understand if UK government, I think should look at that in detail in terms of its new strategy for Africa, its green, its plans for the future, because we could end up at COP26 and be seen, as part of the B team. And I'm not sure that's the position we want to be in. So just pay close attention to what the European partners are doing, because they're doing great things.
Niall, did you want to come in?
More than happy to. Yeah, Costa Rica pledged to be carbon neutral by 2021, which is extraordinary. Of course, they disbanded their military back in the 70s, deciding that this isn't conducive with being a civilized country, having a military that's very active. So well done them. They've taken a very progressive line on things, and they've made it work. That their income on the basis of having extraordinary biodiversity is phenomenal. It's 4 or 5 times that of their neighbours. So they're an exemplar to have to hold up against for the rest of the world. Yeah, for the UK, what Ruth says about DFID is vital. Something I've been really trying to push with DFID over the last couple of years is to put conservation and the environment at the heart of international development aid, because it has to be. Because without that, you're building up a house of cards. You're just patching things over, and it's going to collapse when Kenya turns into a desert as a result of not investing in afforestation programs. So we need to also look at the way that conservation has been financed traditionally. So much of conservation is financed by the tourism industry. Tourism industry has just collapsed. So as a result, conservation has collapsed in many parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And that's a disaster. So we need to rethink the way we finance these industries, and putting it at the heart of our international development aid is a critical part of that. Afforestation programs, forest protection programs, water catchment protection programs, all of these things should be financed, because us as a nation, we benefit when these countries are doing well in terms of their environmental integrity. The next pandemic could well be coming out of Central Africa, another Ebola or whatever else it is. If those forests are intact, then that pandemic won't hit us here. There's so many reasons for us to want to invest in pro-environment policies abroad, and I think DFID need to make that absolutely their central tenet.
Great, thank you, Niall. Our next question comes from Miles Wickstead, who is Professor of International Relations at King's College London and a member of CGP's Advisory Council. And Miles's question is this: the Sustainable Development Goals have yet to be mentioned. Would panelists agree that they provide a framework for addressing these challenges in a coherent way? Who would like a first go at that? Rob.
Yes, that's my answer. I think seriously. Look, understandably, everyone is fixed right now on and still in the shock of capture of this pandemic, and quite rightly too. But as you know, referring back to an earlier conversation about rebuilding economies, you know, we've got to get this back on the agenda. You know, we've got the Convention on Biological Diversity coming up. We've got COP26 coming up. There is, between now and then, to really put this up the priority list, which is going to have, it's going to go against competing, understandably important areas. You know, human resilience has got to come first, we get that. But reinforcing the SDGs, you know, reinforcing commitments made in Paris need to come to the fore right now. I personally think the SDGs are still very relevant. It offers a framework and it's clear to understand. So let's not spend time scratching our heads as how to fix that. Let's get on and start doing something on the ground. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Rob. Niall.
Yeah, Rob's very right, and great question from Miles. So of course, Sustainable Development Goals provide a framework and they provide targets. But the big issue is that there isn't accountability. So if we fail to meet those, that's fine. You just shrug your shoulders and you move on to the next thing. And that's what really needs to change, is that there needs to be actual accountability at government level. And there's various ways of doing that. You can start to create laws around ecocide. So if there's an international framework for damaging the environment, that you can hold governments and individuals and corporations to account, there's a start. Host that in The Hague, add that to the Rome Statutes. That would be a very strong starting point. If countries display humanitarian failings, then they are currently sanctioned through trade. We need to do the same when it comes to environmental failings. What Brazil is currently doing to the Amazon should preclude them from having beneficial trade deals with us and with other nations. And that's, I think, critical, that we hold them to account, firstly through trade, and then secondly through the legal courts. To do that, we need to bolster the legal frameworks around environmental destruction, and incorporating ecocide into the Rome Statute would be a very strong first step.
Thank you, Niall. Another question. How can the UK build new partnerships with countries we have not previously worked with to improve conservation? So we've got a meeting of the G7 next year, we've got COP. Is there anything we're missing? Are there any new alliances we could forge to help drive forward progress in this area? Who would like that one? No.
Sorry, Ruth, I didn't mean to interrupt. I saw your hand up. One of the really positive new programs which DEFRA have released is the Biodiverse Landscape Fund. So what this does, it's a strategic fund where DEFRA have looked at areas of very important biodiversity around the world, and they're trying to fund preservation of those areas. At the moment, they've identified two. They're going to identify others throughout later on this year. Those two areas, one of them is the Kaza, which is around the Zambezi, where 5 countries meet, and the other is the Merindon mountain range between Guatemala and Honduras. Now, the UK has minimal diplomatic influence in both of those regions, and so there's two potential problems there. Firstly, how do we propose on the ground to encourage those countries to cooperate with each other in the way that is necessary to have transboundary conservation? And then secondly, how do we increase our diplomatic influence in those countries? We don't have an embassy in Honduras, for example, and yet we're expected to provide this enormous amount of funding it's tens of millions in order to protect their wildlife. So we need to approach these countries and try and get embassies, use our Foreign Commonwealth Office, which is outstanding, to build these relationships with countries that we traditionally don't have much of a relationship with. Angola, Botswana, currently the relationship has changed as a result of a change in administration. We need to start emphasizing our relationship with Botswana again. The Zambians and the Zimbabweans, obviously we've got great issues down there as well. Zimbabwe haven't been kicked out of the Commonwealth. We're not letting them back in because of humanitarian issues. Maybe we need to look at that again. So the realities on the ground in some of these places have precluded British involvement, but now we're proposing to fund major programs in those areas, perhaps without even really thinking about the consequences of putting money into those areas. So I think the FCO needs to take a really proactive look at this, but then it needs to also talk to DFID and to DEFRA so that we can identify these areas, talk to the Department of International Trade so we can identify business opportunities in these areas as well. We need to be strategically identifying areas of biodiversity importance around the world and going after those with our diplomacy.
Thanks. Ruth, did you want to come in?
Yes, that's okay. No, I mean, I completely agree with that, and with focusing on strategic areas for conservation. I think we should definitely be using our embassy network around the world, and also the Department for International Trade and the international envoys we have there. I think we could also look at interesting schemes in the way we have, we twin towns. It would be quite interesting to look at environmental twinning and something like that, maybe through DIFID, just as an idea. So maybe taking a slightly more creative approach, perhaps, than we have done in the past.
Thanks, Ruth. Rob?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really interesting question. And just building on respect what Ruth has just said, I think the diplomacy, the role that the UK can play is significant. And building on what Niall said, just want to take a step back, that the beauty of the Global Environment Facility or the Global Climate Fund is that they're non-partisan. They don't have the diplomatic baggage or the colonial history and the relationships to deal with, which is why they are so effective. Our foreign policy is necessarily directed at what is important for Britain, which I respect. But when you come up with the Biodiversity Landscape Fund and then you focus it on trans-frontier conservation, you're playing in a difficult space. And Niall mentioned it, I just want to go a step further. We absolutely must respect the wishes and the political diplomatic relations between those countries. They're our partners in this. In fact, they're in the lead here, let's be honest. So Britain can deliver its influence by working with those partner nations and maybe establishing a process through which, with other partners, who may also have diplomatic interests in the region, Francophone or whatever you like, and help those host nations, come to a common position on trans-frontier conservation and climate change action. Because that is often a barrier. National borders, nature doesn't recognize them. And if we are to generate this landscape-focused approach that certainly my organisation, Conservation International, looks to achieve, we've got to overcome this issue. And Britain could do a lot to help set the conditions for those discussions that enable trans-frontier conservation. I think that's an important role.
Great, thank you, Rob. Our next question comes from Andy Clark, who's an ecologist and a filmmaker. And Andy asks, what support is there for using something other than GDP as a measure of a nation's wealth or success in the post-COVID recovery, or in the context of a global Green New Deal? Who would like to have a go at that? Can I come to you, Ivy?
There's more, definitely GDP I think is one of the worst criteria to really measure what will be achievements at the human society. Definitely there's a bigger, great, Bhutan has promoted its happiness indicator instead of just the GDP. I think that's a best practice we can further look into. And I think that is one type of indicator, because after COVID-19, people's panic and the painful feeling, everything, and even the revenge feeling is something needed to be considered other than just money recover of those. So happiness, and the second is cultural perspective. In the conservation and in the development side, the community engagement will be very important. And a lot of indigenous people and the community do not really care how big the house they have, but how happiness or dancing they can have at night. So, but also care about their culture. So how to develop a cultural related indicators to measure the success of recovery from those. I think that there's different, I'm kind of more familiar with Fiji, because I'm being impressed about the Fiji government and also local community develop together the bicultural indicator into their development sections. So those are good practice, best practice. I think it can be learned, or I think the UK government can put all those together as a best practice to share to the global community about how to measure the recovery after post COVID-19.
Thanks. Ruth, I wonder if I might come to you. We've sort of all, well, the exception of frontline workers and MPs, many of us are sort of working from home. We've taken a step off the sort of commute and that sort of lifestyle. Do you see that as being part of a more permanent shift in the context of a green recovery?
Yes, I think we will see definitely more working from home. Not just because of what we've been through with the pandemic, but because people want more flexible working solutions. And I think, you know, we need to make sure we're facilitating careers for people which are not just generating an income for them, but which are also helping them to develop and to have a healthy lifestyle, both mentally and physically. And I think a lot of people feel that traditionally sort of office jobs are not necessarily something that works well for them. So I think we will see that shift. We'll of course need to, and that's, you know, part of the reason why we are sort of investing in broadband. We want to become full fibre by 2025, so that we've got the digital infrastructure there.
Thank you, Ruth. Rob, would you like to come in on that?
So I just had a technical issue there. Yeah, you know, I mean, hold on 1 second. Sorry, can you move on a bit?
Niall, can I come to you just while we give Rob his 20 seconds? I think Trudeau took 21 seconds to answer a question the other day, so we can all take a leaf out of that.
He did. That question was a bit more loaded, though, I think, if you've watched the clip. Yeah, so Eileen touched on it perfectly, really, in that we're using the wrong metrics, and New Zealand, with so many things, can be held up as an international exemplar. When Ardern came into power, the first budget that they released was a well-being budget, a budget that prioritised the well-being of their citizens. I think what we've all noticed over the last 10, 11 weeks of lockdown, whatever it's been, is that all we really require from our government is to try and guarantee our health and our well-being and our security. And this is why things like universal basic income are now being discussed, not as far left loony ideas, but as potentially a way of restructuring our society. Because if people have that comfort of not panicking about where the next paycheck comes from, then there's much more likelihood that they're going to be able to act creatively and in a positive way. Also, I think what COVID-19 has done for everyone that's been in lockdown, anyone that's had a garden has been blessed to be able to look out at birds and listen to nature, and a real focus on that, on encouraging people to be on their bicycles. So actually the transport budget that Grant Shapps released recently is amazing. It looks like Britain really is going to take a leaf after our friends on the other side of the channel and start to try and improve our cycle network, improve our access to public transport, etc., get people out of cars. I think this is key. Another thing the government can do, like the French have done, is to massively de-incentivize the use of damaging transport. So if there's a train line that goes from London to Newcastle, then certainly don't have a plane that's doing the same thing. The French government is doing that. Air France can no longer compete with TGV on certain lines. So the government can really incentivize us to get outside more, use bicycles, walk, get into nature. And I think a focus on that, on the mental health of our society, is critical going forward.
Rob, would you like to come back?
Yeah, sorry, no, I just had a technical issue there. No, I agree. You know, I think just to come at it from a slightly different angle, the biggest thing climate change has suffered from is it's not in our living rooms. You know, it's got to be real to people. you know, COVID-19 has absolutely been tragically in some cases, and will continue to be. So there's a responsibility from our side, you know, to make sure that the messages are very clear and very crisp as to how you act, how governments, why government supports policy X, Y, and Z has a benefit to you and to your family. And I think that's something that we try to do and probably fail to do in some respects. We've got to make it important for everyone, and to acknowledge that part of their taxpayers' money is going towards the restoration of nature, and why that's important. And there's some way to go, I think, for that. And that's the biggest challenge climate changes face. It's not in vogue right now, and it needs to be.
Great. We've got a few minutes left. Would anyone like to make any final remarks? And we've got one more question from an anonymous questionnaire. Let's get it on the screen. Who asks, what is the most important factor in improving conservation, and how can the UK ensure all countries follow this? Would anyone like to take that on and add any final remarks? Rob?
Yeah, people is the most important factor in conservation. And that's very simple. Throughout the whole value chain, if you like, whether that's, you know, accountable governments in the West making decisions, you know, making bold statements and commitments to clear action, whether that's host nation governments understanding that, you know, they have a role to play in the international fight against the impacts of climate change. But like I highlighted in my opening remarks, you know, we can't impose any of this on anyone, nor should we try. We've got to get in behind community leadership. That is the platform, and obviously government buy-in of that community, of course. But once you've got community leadership and you pay attention to how to incentivize change in line with their needs, then you can sustain this work. If you go against any of that, it will fail. So that's my view.
Thanks, Rob. Eileen?
Just so quickly, I totally agree with Rob, the people. On the other side, I just want to highlight biodiversity, that word again. Although within conservation, we're talking a lot, huge about biodiversity, but if we look into other convention, development type of convention, even under the climate-related convention, biodiversity is not mainstream. Even although we try very hard, but it's still not on the table for a lot of those. So for example, the Global Economic Forum, or a lot of those economic related global conversation, biodiversity is not within the top agenda. So I just want to emphasize, this is back to the zoonotic disease. One thing that we really worry about is reduce of the biodiversity actually is a fact to increase the zoonotic disease spill over into the human. So how we can all use the current unfortunate moment to further emphasize the biodiversity, the critical of it, the role into the climate change, into the development, and back to the people. I think that needs to be emphasized again and again, and beyond the conservation groups.
Thank you, Eileen. Bruce, did you want to come in?
Yes,
Final
I think
points?
my point's quite similar to Rob. Actually, I was going to say we need to bring people with us. We can enforce what we do here in the UK, but in terms of around the world, we're not in a position to tell people what they can and can't do. We need to work with them and make sure that we're bringing communities along with us and supporting them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Niall, any very quick finishing remarks, or are you comfortable to leave it there?
The others summed it up, I think, perfectly. People are intrinsic to conservation. People are absolutely the problem, but people are also the solution. And it's the responsibility of all of us to engage people in conservation. And making conservation mainstream, I think, is critical. that's what COVID-19 has done, is that it has made people realize that we have a broken relationship with nature. And the way we prevent this happening again, and the way we guarantee our own prosperity and our own happiness, is by fixing our relationship with nature. Biodiversity has to become central to everything, central to our business plans, central to our foreign policy, central to our domestic policy, central to the World Economic Forum. So biodiversity underpins absolutely every aspect of our livelihoods. In terms of GDP, 50% of global GDP, to go back to GDP, is either moderately or highly dependent upon nature. We cannot afford not to invest in nature. So it simply has to become mainstream.
That's great. Thank you, Niall. We're dead on 5:30, so I think that's going to be all we have time for. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. I think we've had well into the hundreds in terms of numbers over the course of the session. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. To our excellent panel of speakers, Ruth, Eilidh, Niall and Rob, thank you so much. I think we can all agree that it's been fascinating to hear from such a range of experts with a real breadth of experience from all over the world, including Parliament. And I do hope that you've enjoyed this virtual event today. We'll be hosting many more over the coming months. So please keep an eye on the Coalition for Global Prosperity website and Twitter feed to hear more. So thank you very much again, and have a very good afternoon.